The mountain man ordered a young bride by mail, but the elderly woman who arrived changed his life. That's what they say in the hills outside Elk River, where wind howls through pine and memory cuts deeper than frost. Folks remember the letters, the waiting, the quiet man in the cabin high above town. They remember the day the stagecoach rolled in, not with a girl of 19, but with a silver-haired stranger who walked like she belonged to no one. He'd ordered a bride to forget the past. What he got was a storm of truth, a reckoning, and a second chance he never saw coming. Why did she come? And what secret did she carry in that leather-bound trunk? In a land where men carved out silence and sorrow with the swing of an axe, one woman's arrival would thaw more than snow. It would stir up the past and remind a broken man that love, true love, don't always wear a young face. When a letter calls for love and a stranger answers with truth, one question remains. Who found redemption that winter and who finally saw themselves clear as glass? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded how deeply stories like this reach across time, across silence, across miles. If you still believe in second chances, quiet courage, and the kind of love that heals, then you're part of this story too. Tell me which state you're watching from and subscribe to help us keep bringing these powerful tales to life. The wind howled like a wounded thing outside Silas McGraw's cabin, sweeping over the ridge with the kind of bite that cracked wood and stirred old memories. Inside, the fire hissed low, casting shadows that danced across the worn floorboards and the heavy beams overhead. Silas sat hunched at the table, ink-stained fingers curled around a pen fashioned from a whittled goose feather. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, as though the words cost him something. He had never been one for many words. Words hadn't saved his wife. They hadn't stopped the sickness from taking his little girl. And they hadn't kept his old comrades alive through the long nights in Tennessee, when the sky rained bullets and men cried for their mothers. But this was not a letter of war or mourning. This was a request, a contract in ink and silence. He wrote to a woman he did not know, described the mountain as it was, cold, beautiful, lonesome. Described himself plainly, older than most, broken in some ways, whole in others. He offered a roof, food, and his name. He did not mention the nights when he woke screaming, or the chair by the fire that no one sat in anymore. He folded the letter, sealed it, and stared at the snow beyond the window until his breath fogged the glass. Weeks passed. Elk River whispered. Folks at the general store raised eyebrows. A bride, they said. For Silas McGraw? He hadn't been seen in church in over 5 years. Children crossed the street when he came to town. The men tipped their hats out of habit, not warmth. The widow Marlene said she once heard him speak to a deer before letting it go free, and that was the kindest story anyone could recall. When the stagecoach finally came, rattling through the snow-crusted streets and groaning up the slope to his cabin, Silas stood outside in his thick coat, eyes shaded by the brim of his hat. The driver gave him a look like he wasn't sure if this was a delivery or a dare. A woman stepped down, slow but steady. She wore a long gray coat with mother-of-pearl buttons and carried a trunk with leather straps. Her hair, tucked neatly beneath her bonnet, was white as the frost on the trees. She looked up at him without blinking. "You're not 19, Silas said, voice rough as gravel. "And you're not dead," she replied, her tone calm, neither insulted nor amused. "Shall we go inside?" He stepped aside. She passed him, her boots crunching lightly on the frozen path. The driver hesitated, glanced between them, then tipped his hat and rode away, the coach wheels carving fresh scars in the snow. Inside the cabin, the silence thickened. Eleanor set her trunk gently near the hearth and looked around, taking in the rough shelves. The rifle above the mantel, the table with one chair too many. Silas watched her. She did not fuss or speak of travel. She simply nodded once, removed her gloves, and began removing snow from her coat with the back of her hand. "There's stew," he said after a long pause. "I don't eat red meat," she replied. He stared. "I'll make do," she added softly, looking at him like a woman who'd seen worse than cold stew and stranger welcomes. He turned away and added more wood to the fire. Behind him, he could hear her breathing, steady, unafraid. It unnerved him more than screams ever could. He had expected a girl, a young thing with downcast eyes and no voice. What he got was a woman who took up space without asking permission, who carried herself like she'd crossed more than states to get here. As night fell, snow began to patter gently against the windows, and the wind shifted. Two shadows now flickered on the log walls. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Not yet. The silence would say everything, for now. Word of the woman's arrival spread through Elk River before the sun even had a chance to rise fully over the pines. By mid-morning, the whole town had an opinion, though none of them had so much as spoken to Eleanor Whitcomb. From the porch of the general store to the benches outside the church, the talk was loud and constant. Some said it was a cruel trick, that the agency had made a mistake. Others whispered she was a widow who'd answered someone else's ad out of loneliness or worse. Most couldn't decide if Silas McGraw had been fooled or if he had finally gone mad and taken up with a ghost. Down the slope, past the frost-bitten creek, Silas stood in his cabin doorway, arms crossed, jaw tight. Inside, Eleanor stirred a pot over the hearth, the smell of onions and herbs replacing the cold scent of ash that had settled in for years. She moved like the place belonged to her, like she didn't need permission. She'd unpacked only what she needed: a few clothes, a framed photograph of a younger woman, and a small leather-bound Bible that she placed gently on the mantel. "You didn't answer the ad," Silas said, more accusation than question. Eleanor didn't look up from the pot. "I answered what the ad meant." He stared at her. "I wanted someone young. I'm aware." He let the silence stretch like a tight rope between them. When she turned to meet his eyes, she didn't flinch or apologize. She didn't offer an explanation, not the kind he thought he wanted. Instead, she simply said, "A promise was made." Silas turned and walked out into the snow, each step crunching like brittle glass beneath his boots. The wind clawed at his coat, but it was the woman's voice that rang louder in his ears. He paced the clearing behind the cabin, hands buried deep in his pockets, trying to reason with the storm she'd brought. He'd planned on someone who needed saving, someone soft, quiet, desperate. But Eleanor was none of those things. She was composed, sure-footed, and utterly unwilling to be pitied. Inside, she ladled stew into two bowls and set them on the table without ceremony. She sat, folded her hands, and waited. Silas returned after a time, not out of hunger, but to reclaim a space that no longer felt solely his. He took the seat opposite her and watched her eat with small, thoughtful bites. She said nothing about the taste, the cold drafts, or the fact that there were only two forks in the drawer. "You don't plan on leaving," he finally said. "No. Even if I ask, I'll listen, but I won't run." Her words settled heavy between them, not like defiance, but like a fact, unshakable, already decided. It unsettled him more than any outburst would have. She didn't try to win him over. She just stayed. And that somehow made him feel more exposed than if she'd shouted in his face. That evening, Eleanor swept the floor and refolded the blankets near the hearth. She hummed softly, a tune Silas didn't recognize, and paused now and then to stare into the fire as if reading something in the flames. Silas sat by the window, pretending to whittle, but never once looked down at the wood. His eyes stayed on her. Every movement she made seemed deliberate, practiced, as if she'd done this before, not in his home, but in others like it, where sorrow clung to the walls and silence screamed for company. He didn't trust her, Not yet, but he didn't tell her to leave either. When she finally extinguished the lamp and climbed into the bedroll near the fire, Silas remained awake, listening to her breathing. It was steady, calm, as if she belonged nowhere else. And for the first time in years, he wondered, not about who she was, but why she'd come all this way just to stay in a place like this, with a man like him. The storms came heavier than before, bearing the narrow trail that led down to Elk River. The world outside the cabin shrank until only the sound of wind and the creak of frozen pines remained. The snow rose past the window ledge, sealing them in with its white silence. Days passed in slow procession, one blending into the next, time marked only by the rhythm of breath and the dull scrape of shovel against ice. For Silas McGraw, who had lived years alone in that mountain hollow, this should have been no different than any other winter. But now there was another presence, steady, patient, and impossible to ignore. Eleanor Whitcomb had brought something the storm couldn't bury: quiet purpose. Each morning she woke before him. The fire was always lit when he stirred, the smell of porridge or boiled potatoes already drifting through the small room. She didn't speak much at first. She moved about like a ghost of grace, sweeping the hearth, mending torn cloth, humming low tunes without words. Once she stepped out into the biting cold, her shawl tight around her shoulders, to stand before the apple tree by the fence line, a thing so dead that even crows ignored it. She brushed away the snow from its crooked limbs and whispered something Silas couldn't hear. He thought her foolish then, wasting warmth on what couldn't be revived, but she did it every morning after. Silas kept to his habits. He split wood until his shoulders burned, fetched water from the creek through a tunnel of frost, and avoided looking at her for longer than he needed. He told himself she was a boarder, a stranger bound by a misunderstanding soon to be corrected come spring. Yet somehow the space between them began to change. They spoke first about the weather, how the wind shifted, how long until the thaw, then about soup, about the dull tools that needed sharpening, about the sound of wolves beyond the ridge. Her voice, soft but sure, began to fill the corners of the cabin in ways the fire never could. One afternoon he came in from the cold and found her at the window, needle in hand, mending a tear in his coat without asking. He watched her fingers move, steady and certain, the thread glinting in the firelight. When she looked up, there was no apology in her eyes, only calm acknowledgement. "It was fraying," she said. "Things left untended don't last." He wanted to protest, to reclaim his solitude, but something in her tone made it sound less like a chore and more like a truth. He said nothing, only hung up the coat when she was done, and felt, for reasons he couldn't name, a little less heavy. The evenings grew longer. The wind rattled the windows as though trying to claw its way inside. And still Eleanor sat near the hearth, her hands folded in her lap, eyes closed. Once, he caught her whispering a prayer, her fingers trembling around the candle she'd lit. It was a small light, barely a spark against the night, but it reached him more than he wished it would. When she blew it out, darkness swallowed the room, and for a moment Silas thought he heard her weep. But the sound was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the quiet crackle of the fire. He lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint rhythm of her breath across the room. It had been years since another human sound filled his nights. He didn't know whether it comforted or haunted him. The ghost that once prowled his dreams seemed quieter somehow, as if kept at bay by her presence. He found himself wondering what she prayed for: safety, forgiveness, or maybe simply warmth. By the end of that long week, something subtle had shifted. The cabin no longer felt like a tomb, but a place where time might still move forward. When Eleanor stood again by the apple tree, brushing away the new snow, Silas paused at the doorway, watching her lips move. Her breath rose in clouds against the pale morning, her hands resting on the bark as though greeting an old friend. For the first time, he didn't think her foolish. He thought her brave. That night, as he closed the shutters against another round of storm, he turned to find her looking up at him. Neither spoke. She nodded once, the faintest ghost of a smile on her lips, then reached for the candle. The light trembled between them before she set it down. He sat across from her, close enough to feel the warmth of the fire, but far enough to keep the ache of memory at bay. Still, when the candlelight flickered across her face, Silas thought that maybe, just maybe, the quiet wasn't such an enemy after all. The morning began like all others since the storm had shut the world out. Gray sky pressing low, snow still thick on the ridge, and the familiar groan of wood settling in the cold. Silas rose early to check the traps he'd set near the tree line. The wind bit through his coat, and the powder crunched underfoot. When he found the first trap twisted and useless, the wire snapped clean, he cursed under his breath. It wasn't the first to break this week. The cold rusted everything. Tools dulled faster. Even his patience had started to fray. He carried the mangled trap back to the cabin, dropping it beside the door with a grunt. He didn't say a word as he pulled off his gloves and stomped the snow from his boots. Eleanor glanced up from her place by the stove, hands dusted with flour. She said nothing, only looked at the broken snare and then at him. Later that afternoon, after he'd gone to split more wood, he returned to find the trap set neatly on the table, repaired, tightened, and reinforced with fresh wire. Better than before. Silas stared at it, then at her. She didn't look up from the book in her lap, her fingers idly smoothing a ribbon that marked the page. The hinge was bent, she said softly. I use the iron awl behind the stove. You really should oil it more often. He narrowed his eyes. That trap's older than most of the men in town. All the more reason not to let it die without trying. She closed the book then, finally looking at him. Her face was calm, unreadable, but her gaze held his without flinching. No apology, no pride, just understanding. He picked up the trap and turned it in his hands, checking the tension. You done this before? I've fixed worse. Children break things faster than cold ever could. Her voice warmed then, just a touch. I taught in a schoolhouse in Pennsylvania for 16 years. Never once had a day without something torn or tangled. He grunted and sat. Didn't figure you for a teacher. Most don't. She smiled, small and fleeting. But books saved me once. I tried to pass that along. They sat in the quiet again. The only sound the hiss of the fire and the soft turning of pages as she opened her book once more. Silas didn't speak for a long while, but something gnawed at him, a thing he hadn't touched in years. After supper, when she was washing the tin bowls in silence, he stood, walked to the far wall, and pulled aside the old quilt that hung like a curtain. Beneath it sat a wooden trunk, scarred and faded. He knelt, unlocked it, and drew out a small, dust-covered music box. It was shaped like a church, the edges softened by time. He held it like it might break from memory alone. Belonged to my daughter, he said. Used to wind it for her before bed. She liked the tune, called it the Dancing Church. Eleanor said nothing, only dried her hands slowly and stepped closer. Does it still play? He shrugged. Ain't tried in years. He turned the key with care. The mechanism groaned, then sprang to life in halting notes. A tiny melody floated into the room, high and distant, like wind chimes in fog. Neither spoke as it played. Eleanor sat across from him, her face turned slightly to listen. Her eyes shimmered, not with tears but with knowing. When the final note faded, Silas closed the lid gently and placed the box on the table between them. Why'd you keep it buried? She asked. He looked at the fire, his voice low. Some things hurt too much to burn, but too much to look at, too. Her hands folded in her lap still. That's why I brought only one photo, she said. It's easier to carry what we don't unfold. For the first time since she arrived, Silas let his shoulders drop. Not defeat, release. There was no talk of love, no sweet glances or promises. Just two people with pasts so heavy they'd learned to walk carefully through each other's silence. But in that hush, something flickered, like a candle lit not for light, but remembrance. They sat that way until the fire burned low. Neither moved. The cabin, always too full of ghosts, felt different now. Not empty, not healed, but shared. And that was something. The snow had slowed that morning, falling soft and steady like the hush between sentences. Eleanor rose before Silas, as she often did now, moving through the cabin with the quiet rhythm of someone who'd learned how to live without disturbing grief when it sleeps. She swept the hearth, folded the blankets, and gathered the empty bowls from last night's stew. In the process of shaking out the bedding near Silas's cot, her foot nudged something beneath the bed frame, a hard edge, the clink of metal. She crouched and drew back the woven blanket that hung like a curtain beneath the cot. There it was, a trunk, low and long, made of thick oak, its iron corners dulled with age and use. The latch was old but sturdy, and a small brass padlock gleamed faintly in the morning light. She didn't touch it, just sat back on her heels considering. It was the kind of box that held more than things. It held silence, memory, weight. She didn't need to open it to know that. When Silas came in from the morning woodpile, she was sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a cup of hot water, steam curling over her face. She didn't look up right away. He noticed the shift in her posture, the quiet question she hadn't voiced yet, and his jaw tightened. "There's a trunk," she said finally. "I didn't open it." He nodded once, stiff. "It stays locked." "I figured." She took a slow sip, then added, "I had one too, back in Lancaster. Kept it in the cellar under the stairs." He stood by the stove, feeding logs into the fire. "And a sycamore tree grew in our backyard," she said. "One spring, lightning came down through the kitchen and split the tree in half. I thought it would die. It didn't. The next year it grew sideways, bent, broken, but still blooming." He paused, hands still on the iron poker. "I kept that trunk under the stairs," she continued. "Letters, a ribbon, a few drawings from children I couldn't save. I told myself I'd burn them someday, but I never did." Silas stared into the flames, as if they might swallow the words she'd just laid down like kindling. He didn't speak. She didn't press. Her voice had been calm, not prying, not even sad, just true. Without a word, he pulled on his coat and stepped outside. The door creaked shut behind him. Eleanor turned back to her cup. Silas trudged past the cabin's edge, boots sinking in the softening snow. The wind met him like an old enemy, sharp and insistent. He walked past the apple tree she'd been tending, its limbs still bare but no longer brittle. It stood crooked and stubborn in the clearing. He remembered when he first tried to cut it down, and the blade bounced back as though the tree itself refused surrender. He didn't know how long he stood at the ridge, staring out across the valley. The sky was the color of old iron, the distant hills swallowed in mist. His hands burned with cold, but he didn't move. Her words echoed in him, about broken things, about trees that survived. He hated how they landed, hated how true they felt. That night he didn't speak during supper. He lay on his cot long after the fire dimmed, the shadows long and still across the walls. He listened to Eleanor's breathing across the room, steady and near. And then the dreams came. The girl ran through tall grass, laughing. Her voice, high and sweet, called back to someone unseen. The sun hung low over a field, gold and full. Then smoke, screams, the clap of fire devouring wood. He tried to reach her, but his feet wouldn't move. The house cracked open like a matchbox, flames licking the sky. He woke with a jolt, damp with sweat. The fire was nothing but embers now. Across the room, Eleanor sat by the window, wrapped in a shawl, staring at the stars. She turned slightly, sensing him awake. Their eyes met. She didn't ask about the dream. She only nodded once and turned back to the night. Silas lay back down, staring at the ceiling. He knew the lock on that trunk wouldn't hold forever. Something had begun to shift. A root breaking through cold ground. A crack letting in light. Something he wasn't ready for, but something that was already here. The snow had begun to recede, just enough for a wagon's wheels to find the ruts of the old mountain path. From the window, Eleanor saw the dark silhouette of a horse and buggy inching up the trail, the preacher's black hat bobbing in rhythm with each jolt of the wheels. Silas stood behind her, arms crossed, saying nothing, but the hard set of his jaw betrayed him. Visitors meant questions. Questions meant remembering. Reverend Josiah Mallory was a man whose voice could calm a room, and whose eyes missed very little. His beard was touched with white now, but his back was straight, and his Bible always tucked under one arm, like it belonged there by birthright. He stepped down from the buggy with a jar of cherry preserves in one hand and a narrow smile in the other. "I figured if the Lord could make it up this hill, so could I," he said as Eleanor opened the door. She greeted him with a warmth that surprised even Silas. "Josiah," she said, not Reverend. "It's been a long time." He handed her the preserves. "I thought I recognized the name. Didn't expect to find you in a mountain cabin with Silas McGraw." Silas gave him a cautious nod. "You two know each other?" "Lancaster," the Reverend answered, stepping inside. "I preached there some years back. Miss Whitcomb was known for her schoolhouse and her stubbornness." Eleanor laughed lightly and poured tea without asking. Silas watched the exchange, his guard rising in quiet increments. He didn't trust men who smiled too quickly, especially not when they brought town dust with them. Outside in the valley below, the town of Elk River stirred with whispers. Mallory's buggy hadn't gone unnoticed. The butcher's wife, who'd once tried to send a pie up the mountain and had it returned unopened, leaned over her porch rail to speculate with the milliner. They'd heard about the woman who stepped off the stagecoach. Older, not what was advertised. Rumors stretched and bent like wet laundry in the wind. Some said she was hiding from something. Others that Silas had lost his mind, ordering a young bride and keeping an old ghost instead. And inside the cabin, the Reverend sipped his tea and glanced from Eleanor to Silas. "I see the fire's been kept well," he said, eyes settling on the small wood-carved cross above the mantel. "That's no small thing. Not up here." Eleanor nodded. "The storm's been long, but not so bitter as it used to be." Mallory studied them both. "You've changed, Silas. The man I knew would have run a preacher off with a shotgun." "I still might," Silas grunted, though without heat. The Reverend smiled but didn't let go of the thread. "They say in town you ordered a girl and got a woman of God instead. Some wonder what kind of man you must be to keep her here. Others figure she's the one keeping you." Silas shifted in his chair. "Let them wonder." "I do," Mallory said, his tone softening. "But I also see something they don't. There's a light in this place again, not just firelight, something lived in, whole." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was full. Eleanor served more tea, her movement steady. She didn't try to defend her presence. She didn't need to. The Reverend stood to leave not long after. As he reached the door, he placed a hand on Silas's shoulder, not in judgment, but in quiet blessing. People in Elk River have long memories, but they also know truth when they see it. Don't be surprised when some start coming up this road with more than gossip. After he left, the cabin felt still again, but not empty. That night, as Silas chopped wood by lantern light, he heard voices drifting from the dark ridge behind the house, townsfolk whispering as they passed. He caught his own name, heard mad old man once. "She's not what he paid for," said another. Eleanor stood at the doorway, arms folded. "You heard them?" He nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "Do you care?" He looked up at her, lit by the warm glow spilling from inside. "I did," he said, "but not tonight." Inside the cabin, the jar of cherry preserves sat unopened on the shelf, like a promise waiting for spring. And outside, beneath the moonlight, the apple tree stood rooted, still bare, but not dead. The wind had turned that day, rolling down from the northern peaks with a sharpness that bit through coats and turned even the town's most stubborn mouths silent. Dust and ice mingled in the air as hooves clattered into Elk River. Jackson Terrell rode in like he owned the road, his black coat whipping behind him like a banner, and his boots polished cleaner than any man's soul had a right to be. Folks looked up from their porches and shops, eyes narrowing as the man dismounted, flicked a gold watch from his vest pocket, and gave the town a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was the kind of man who sold futures like promises and treated land like poker chips. A land agent, railroad consultant, and snake by any other name. With a leather satchel slung over his shoulder and silver spurs glinting in the pale morning sun, he made his way to the general store where the gossip flowed thickest. "Name's Tyrell," he said loud enough for ears near and far. "I've got business with a Mr. Silas McGraw. Seems there's some confusion about who owns that mountain parcel he's squatting on. Paperwork says it's overdue. Railroad says it's valuable. I say it's time things got settled." The townsfolk stirred. No one spoke outright, but the tension spread fast. Tyrell took note of each raised brow, each half step back, and let it stoke his fire. He could smell opportunity like a hound on blood. And then his tone shifted. "Also heard tell he's got himself a new bride." He let the word hang, dripping with suspicion. "Funny thing is, I saw the agency's file on the young lady meant to arrive. Blonde, 21, from Missouri. But word is someone else stepped off that coach." Murmurs rippled. Mrs. Abernathy, the seamstress, frowned and whispered to her sister. Mr. Fields scratched his beard and looked toward the hills. Tyrrell leaned in, his voice low and taunting. "That ain't the woman who answered the ad. Makes a man wonder what's really going on up there in that cabin." Back on the mountain, Silas felt the cold in his bones before he heard the knock of the world returning. He didn't need to see Tyrell's face to know what sort of trouble stirred in town. Eleanor, standing at the sink with her sleeves rolled, paused when the wind picked up. She looked toward the window, then down at her hands. Later that night, after supper passed in silence and the fire dulled to a glow, Eleanor opened her trunk. From beneath a folded shawl, she pulled a sealed letter. It was worn now, corners bent, but still unopened. Her name was scrawled on the front in a hand she'd never seen. She sat at the table, the letter resting between her palms. Silas said nothing, but he watched. After a long while, she rose, took the letter to the hearth, and knelt beside the flames. Her hands didn't tremble as she slid the envelope into the embers. The paper curled and blackened, the seal splitting open with a soft pop as it turned to ash. She stayed there, watching it burn until nothing remained. When she stood, Silas was still seated, eyes fixed on the fire. She didn't speak, and neither did he. But something shifted in the air between them. Not sorrow, not relief, but something older and deeper, like a wound left unclean that finally met open air. Outside, the cold clawed at the windows. Down below, Jackson Terrell polished his boots and smiled to himself, believing the mountain man wouldn't fight. But he hadn't seen the way Eleanor's hands had stilled in the firelight, or the way Silas's silence had turned to steel. The past had come knocking, but not every door would open easy. The morning after the fire swallowed her letter, the sky remained still and pale. Clouds stretched thin like muslin across the heavens. The storm had passed, but the air held its breath. Silas rose early, as he always did, but he didn't go to the woodpile or the snare line. He sat at the table with his arms crossed, staring at the hearth as if the ashes there still spoke. Eleanor moved quietly behind him, placing bread in the oven and feeding the small fire with care. They said nothing through breakfast. No mention of Tyrell, no mention of what might come, just the scrape of tin plates and the crackle of dry kindling. But there was a weight in the room now, one not born of weather or threat, but of readiness. It wasn't the kind of silence that hides things. It was the kind that asks without words, "Are you ready to speak?" Eleanor answered without being asked. She sat down across from him, folding her hands over the table. The light caught the thin silver strands in her hair, and when she looked at him, her eyes were not full of sorrow. They were steady like water that had run deep for a long time. "I was promised once," she said, "to a man named Calhoun Pierce. He was tall, clumsy, gentle, read poetry like it was gospel. We were set to be married come spring, but spring came, and he'd already gone to war." Silas said nothing. He didn't blink. "He wrote me letters, told me about the rivers, the smoke, the things he saw that no man should have seen. And then they stopped coming. I waited months, a year. His mother kept hoping, but I knew. I just knew." She didn't lower her eyes. She didn't tremble. "After that, I took care of people. My father when he fell ill, then my mother, children in my schoolhouse, widows who had less than I did. I made a life of filling holes in other people's hearts, never once thinking I deserved to mend my own." She glanced toward the door, toward the ridge where the wind no longer howled. "When I saw your ad, Silas, I didn't see a lonely man. I saw a man trying to bury something deeper than time. I recognized it. That kind of silence. You didn't ask for help, but I came anyway." Silas stood slowly, pushing the chair back without a word. His steps were slow as he crossed to the wall, pulling aside the quilt. The lock on the trunk shone faintly in the firelight. He knelt, withdrew a small key from his pocket, and opened it. Inside, the past waited. A small dress, faded pink, still clinging to the faint scent of wildflowers. A toy horse, blackened and blistered by fire, one wooden leg missing. A photograph, corners curled, of a young woman smiling beneath an open sky, her hair swept by wind, a child held in her arms. Eleanor rose but didn't move closer. She waited. Silas stared down into the box for a long time. His voice when it came was low and raw. "My wife was named Anna. Our daughter Elsie. The fire took them both. Cabin was smaller back then. Stovepipe cracked. I was out hunting." He didn't explain further. Didn't need to. Eleanor stepped forward then, not to touch but to kneel beside him, not to offer comfort, but presence. They stayed there, the two of them, in the hush of that small room where sorrow no longer needed hiding. The ghosts weren't gone, but now they had names. And in naming them, something within the silence began to shift. Neither wept, but both breathed easier. The days grew longer, though the snow still held fast to the mountain. Ice clung to the trees like a second bark, and the creek sang its thin song beneath the brittle crust. But it wasn't just spring that stirred in Elk River. It was suspicion. Jackson Tyrrell's words had spread like smoke, curling into corners where doubt already lived. They came in twos and threes, townsfolk with their hats clutched and eyes sharpened by gossip. They knocked without warning, and when the door opened, their glances slid past Silas and landed on Eleanor, measuring her with something colder than the wind. One woman, red-cheeked and bitter-faced, asked plainly, "Are you really who you say you are?" Another man, a mill hand with more opinion than sense, muttered, "Hard to believe she just showed up by accident, don't you think?" One even leaned on the porch rail and spat in the snow. "A widow or a schemer," he said, loud enough for the pine trees to hear. Eleanor answered none of them directly. She served coffee if they asked for it, turned them away when they didn't. She stood behind Silas, not in his shadow, but as his equal, unmoved, unflinching. Silas, for his part, said little. His silence, carved from years of grief and habit, held no warmth, and to those who didn't understand him, it looked like guilt. His eyes, always hard to read, were taken for shame. Whispers thickened in town. Some claimed Eleanor had come for the land. Others said she had bewitched him with quiet words and old tricks. Strange things happen up on that ridge, someone whispered near the blacksmith's. First his wife and child, now this woman. Death follows silence. One evening, Silas returned from the woods to find Eleanor standing on the porch, holding a small, torn scrap of wood in her hand. Someone had nailed it to the cabin door in the hours he'd been away. The letters were crude, scrawled with a knife. Send her away before more die. She said nothing as he approached. Her hands were steady, the piece of wood tucked gently against her palm. Without a word, she turned, walked inside, and fed it to the fire. The flame caught it quickly, and the letters twisted into smoke. She returned to her chair, picked up her knitting, and resumed her quiet rhythm. Let them talk, she said, her voice even. Let them howl like coyotes in the dark. I've lived through worse storms than this. Silas stood by the door for a long while, watching her. He saw the firelight flicker across her face, softening the lines carved by years, not erasing them, but honoring them. In that moment, he understood that her strength didn't come from defiance, it came from survival. Not loud or angry, but enduring. Rooted. He sat across from her, hands still stained from the forest, and found himself wondering something dangerous, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Maybe he wasn't cursed. Maybe he didn't have to carry punishment like a second skin. Maybe, just maybe, he was allowed this. This quiet strength across the room, this steady breath beside his, this woman who turned threats to ash and fear into thread. He didn't speak, but for the first time, he didn't feel the need to. The snow had begun to recede in earnest, leaving behind a patchwork of dark soil and brittle grass. Meltwater trickled down the rocks, whispering of a thaw not only in the land, but in hearts long hardened. The wind was still sharp, but it no longer cut. It carried with it the scent of something stirring beneath the earth. One morning, just after the frost lifted from the window panes, Reverend Mallory arrived again. His coat was dusted with road salt, and the buggy horse steamed gently as he tied it to the post. He brought with him two things tucked beneath his arm, a weather-worn ledger and a sealed envelope. Silas met him at the door with a nod. No pleasantries passed. Eleanor poured coffee before being asked, and the three of them sat at the table like something sacred hovered between them. This, Mallory said, tapping the ledger, is the original town registry. It shows your father bought the land outright before the war. No liens, no encumbrances. Tyrrell's papers won't hold up under daylight. Silas leaned forward, brows knit. You sure? I wouldn't bring it if I weren't. Mallory looked to Eleanor, then placed the envelope beside her plate. And this is from Clara Whitaker, the girl who was meant to answer that ad. She married a shop clerk in Dakota 2 months before your letter reached her. The agency didn't follow up, didn't send word, but the notice made it into the back of a church bulletin. That's how someone found it. Eleanor's hands rested gently on the envelope. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. I saw her name, she said quietly. Saw the photograph of her wedding in a paper lining a box of pears. That same day, I saw his letter. She looked to Silas. The timing felt like something more than chance. Mallory watched her carefully. Why come all this way, Miss Whitcomb? Eleanor's eyes didn't waver. Some debts can't be paid with coin, only with presence. I don't owe Silas anything, but I owed myself the truth of whether I could still give. Mallory nodded. That's the kind of answer a preacher understands. He stood after that, tucked the ledger back under his arm, and left them to the quiet. But as he rode down the hill, he passed two families on foot, carrying baskets, jars, and conversation. The mountain once avoided was drawing footsteps again, and Mallory, wise in the ways of souls, began quietly speaking to shopkeepers, church elders, and farmers with long memories. He didn't raise a banner, didn't give a sermon. He simply reminded folks what grace looked like when it was lived. Back inside, Eleanor stepped out to fetch water from the creek. When she returned, Silas wasn't by the fire or at the woodpile. She found him instead seated on a log behind the cabin, a small notebook resting on his knee, a piece of charcoal in his hand. She approached slowly, not wishing to disturb. He didn't hide the page. He let her see. It was the apple tree sketched in firm, careful lines, still leafless, but alive, rooted, reaching. "I didn't know you drew," she said softly. "I didn't know I still could," he replied, not looking up. They stood in silence for a moment, both staring at the shape of the tree. Then Eleanor said, "The buds are forming, just under the bark. You can't see them yet, but they're there." Silas glanced at her. "That a fact?" "It is." He nodded slowly. "I reckon spring might not be as far off as it feels." That night the cabin glowed warmer. They spoke, not of past wounds or future threats, but of seedlings, of garden plots, of how many boards it might take to build a second chair for the porch. The conversation was unhurried, ordinary, but to them it felt like sunlight returning after a long, long winter. The sound of hooves on packed dirt came fast and sharp that morning, echoing off the stone faces of the ridge before anyone saw the dust rising. Silas looked up from the chicken coop he'd been mending, already knowing who it was before the first horse cleared the bend. Eleanor, standing near the porch with a pail of water in her hands, turned slowly. She didn't need the name. She remembered the way arrogance carried itself. Jackson Tyrrell rode in like a man claiming what was already his. Behind him, two others flanked his sides, lean, mean-eyed men with pistols hanging from their hips and no interest in the scenery. Tyrrell dismounted slowly, like he wanted to be watched, every motion performed with oily confidence. He removed his gloves, one finger at a time, before reaching into his coat and pulling out a rolled document sealed with a red ribbon. "McGraw," he called, voice slick as a creekstone. "We've got business." Silas didn't answer. He stepped closer to Eleanor, who now stood quietly beside the porch rail, back straight, chin high. She didn't flinch when Tyrrell's eyes landed on her. "You again," he said, tone dripping with contempt. "Still playing house on land that don't belong to you. And her?" He waved the rolled paper like a whip. "She's nothing but a squatter in a borrowed room." One of the hired men snorted. The other spit into the dirt. "She's got no legal claim," Tyrrell continued. "No marriage license, no contract, not even a name on a deed. If she doesn't leave this property, she'll be charged with unlawful occupation." Eleanor said nothing, but her hand tightened around the handle of the water pail. Silas stepped down from the porch, placing himself directly between her and Tyrrell. His voice was calm, but there was steel in it, forged by years of loss and long winters. "She's mine by choice," he said, "not by paper, and she stays." Tyrrell's smile cracked, sharp and quick. "Careful, McGraw. Don't make this harder than it has to be." "You already made it hard," Silas said, stepping forward now, shoulders squared. "Coming up my mountain, waving lies in my face, bringing men like that to scare a woman." The two men shifted, hands resting near their belts. Tyrrell raised a hand, not to de-escalate, but to savor the tension. "You'll be hearing from the court," he said. "I'll be back with a written badge. And when I do, she won't be standing behind you. She'll be gone." He turned then, satisfied enough to let the threat hang like smoke. The hired men mounted up, and within moments the three of them were riding back down the trail, their silhouettes swallowed by dust and pine. Silas turned to Eleanor. Her face was unreadable, but her knuckles were pale where they still gripped the pail. He reached out and took it from her hand, setting it down gently on the porch. "Do you regret it?" she asked him. "Me coming here, staying." He shook his head, slow and certain. "You came when no one else would." She didn't speak again, but the question no longer sat between them like a wall. That night, long after the fire had settled into coals and the world outside hushed to silence, a sound tapped lightly on the roof. A drip, then another. The snow at last had begun to melt, and somewhere beneath the surface, roots stirred, awakened by the warmth of a man who had chosen, not to forget, but to begin again. The thaw crept in slow, like a secret. What began as a drip on the roof became a stream through the gullies, and soon the hillsides wept with meltwater. But it wasn't only the snow breaking apart. Elk River itself began to split. Word of Tyrell's return, of his threats and those forged papers, had moved faster than any wagon, and now the town talked louder than ever, but it no longer spoke with one voice. Some saw only dollar signs. The railroad meant more than progress. It meant power, opportunity, a chance to become something more than a dot on a map. Tyrell promised jobs and land payouts, new buildings, new names on the storefronts. Men who once nodded to Silas at the post office now turned away, unsure whether siding with a reclusive, war-worn man and a mysterious woman would cost them their chance at something bigger. But not all hearts bend so easily. Reverend Mallory spoke quietly at first. From the pulpit, he reminded the congregation of dignity, of compassion, of truth that did not bow to profit. Then came Maeve, the midwife with hands stronger than most men, and eyes that had seen too much to be swayed by gold. "I've delivered half this town's children," she said at the store one afternoon. "I know what it means to stand beside someone when no one else will." Then there was Jonas, the general store owner, who posted a sign in his window. "We stand with Eleanor Whitcomb and Silas McGraw. This land is not for sale." It wasn't long before a petition began. Reverend Mallory carried it in the pocket of his coat, collecting signatures one voice at a time. Not against Tyrell, not directly, but for peace, for the right to hold land honestly, for a woman's dignity not to be dragged through mud simply because she was not young or soft-spoken. It spread like fire in dry grass, crossing fences and shop counters, changing conversations that had once ended in suspicion. Still, not everyone signed. Some sneered when the Reverend approached. Some muttered about outsiders, about order, about letting the law decide. The blacksmith refused outright. The banker said he needed to think. The tavern stayed neutral, but the talk inside it soured. Up on the ridge, Silas and Eleanor didn't ask who stood for them and who didn't. They could feel the tremble of it in the ground, the way the wind carried voices that hadn't reached them before. They didn't speak of worry, but it moved through their days in subtle rhythms. Silas chopped wood with a kind of purpose, stacking it higher along the cabin wall. Eleanor swept each corner of the home, cleaned the windows with vinegar, and patched the curtains with careful stitches. If they were to be judged, they would not be judged for neglect. Together they cleared the thawed patch beside the cabin. The soil was still cold, but it yielded to her touch. Eleanor pressed seeds into the dirt, radishes, carrots, beans, her hands working with steady faith. Silas knelt beside her, his calloused fingers clumsy at first, then sure. When their hands brushed in the dirt, neither pulled away. Inside the cabin, she lined the pantry shelves, labeling jars. He sharpened tools and reinforced the doors. The place, once a shelter of grief, now braced itself not against the cold, but against intrusion. At night they sat side by side, the fire crackling low. the soft scrape of her knitting needles keeping time with the wind. They did not speak of Tyrrell or of town divisions. They spoke of practical things, of planting rows straighter next time, of how many boards were left in the shed, of where to hang the clothesline come May. Outside, Elk River churned in its quiet war, but within the walls of that cabin, there was something rooted now, steady and calm, like a garden waiting beneath the frost for sun. The church in Elk River had never held a trial, but on that gray April morning, it became a courthouse. The pews, polished by years of prayer and mourning, filled with townsfolk who wore their Sunday coats, though it was only Thursday. They didn't come for scripture, they came for judgment. Reverend Mallory stood at the front, not in his pulpit, but at the wide table set beneath the wooden cross. Beside him sat Judge Alton from down in Stillwater, called in to preside with a calm hand. He was a lean man with tired eyes and a voice that cut through pretense like a whetstone on bone. Jackson Tyrrell arrived with his boots shining and his lies sharpened. He placed his satchel on the table like a trophy, unrolling maps and deeds with exaggerated care. He spoke first, loud, rehearsed, the words laced with mockery. "Silas McGraw is a relic," he said to the room, "a man who let his taxes lapse, whose memory's gone soft with time. And this woman," he waved a hand toward Eleanor without even looking at her, "is not who she claims to be. No marriage, no family, no proof. Just a drifter looking for a warm roof and a claim to something that isn't hers." He turned, letting the words settle. "I hold here new documents, signed and sealed, confirming the railroad's rightful acquisition of the land." He smiled. Too wide. The silence afterward was long, not still, charged, like the air before lightning. Eleanor stood. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. "My name is Eleanor Whitcomb. I came here of my own will, not to take but to tend. This land, this man, was not abandoned. It was grieving. Grief is not madness. Silence is not weakness." Her hands folded before her did not tremble. "You speak of paper, but I speak of presence. I have mended every hinge in that home, planted every row, chopped wood and carried water. I have walked through storms not only of weather, but of judgment." She looked straight at Tyrrell then. "I am not young, but my hands know how to build, and my back has carried more than your ledgers ever will. If you measure a woman's worth by age or beauty, you'll miss the gold beneath the stone." The room held its breath. Then Reverend Mallory stepped forward, his voice steady. "In this folder," he said, placing it before the judge, "is the original deed to McGraw's land, properly recorded in the Stillwater Registry. Alongside it, a copy of the ad Silas placed with the matrimonial agency, and a letter from Clara Whitaker, the young woman who was intended to come, but married elsewhere before she ever read it." He set his hands flat on the table. "Miss Whitcomb took her place not through deceit, but through compassion." The judge took the folder, leafed through the pages. Tyrrell's smile cracked. He moved to speak, but the judge held up a hand. "These documents are authentic," the judge said, "and yours, Mr. Tyrrell, show signs of tampering. You'll answer for that elsewhere." Tyrrell turned red, sputtered, tried again to speak, but the moment had turned. From the pews, someone began to clap, a slow, deliberate sound, then another, then many. The church filled with applause, not wild, not unruly, but certain, a sound not of victory, but of truth rising after too long buried. Eleanor remained still, but her eyes shone. Silas, seated behind her, let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding since winter first fell. In the town of Elk River, where silence once ruled and judgment came fast, a different kind of reckoning had arrived, and this time it stood in the light. The sun had barely crested over the hills when the sound of iron hooves and clipped commands echoed through Elk River's narrow streets. Dust kicked up in neat spirals as Marshal Graves rode in with two deputies and a letter sealed with the weight of the county court. He was a man of few words, lean and gray-eyed, with a mustache that drooped like it had witnessed too much truth and too many lies. He didn't stop to explain himself. He didn't need to. Terrell was still at the boarding house, packing hastily, fuming behind drawn curtains when the knock came. It was not a question. Graves entered with the air of inevitability, unfolding the paper with the authority of law and justice both. Jackson Tyrell, you're under arrest for fraud, document tampering, and coercion with intent to defraud private property owners. You'll come with us now, Tyrell sputtered. You can't. This is a misunderstanding. I work for the railroad. I'm authorized. Save it for still water. Graves cut in, nodding to the deputies. They stepped forward without hesitation. Tyrell's face drained of color as the manacles closed around his wrists. The two hired men who'd ridden with him, so bold just days before, were gone by sundown, slipping out of town with their hats low and their spurs quiet. No one stopped them. No one cared to. The news swept Elk River like a spring flood. The whispers that once shadowed Silas's name turned on their heels. The man in the mountains, once mocked as broken, was now spoken of with something nearing reverence. The cabin no longer stood as a monument to isolation. It became a symbol of truth held firm through frost and fire. The next day, Reverend Mallory stood on the steps of the church and read a short note from the county seat. The land was legally affirmed. Tyrell would not return. The crowd that gathered didn't cheer, but the silence that followed was a kind of peace, a reckoning paid in full. Eleanor walked among them, her chin lifted, her hands folded before her. People who once glanced away now offered her nods, handshakes, even pie. Some stumbled over their words, uncertain how to speak to a woman they had once judged and now could not ignore. Miss Whitcomb, the school board chairman said, clearing his throat, the children in town, well, they could use a steady hand. The old schoolhouse has been empty too long. If you'd consider teaching again. Eleanor smiled softly, her eyes holding no grudge. I'll need to sweep the dust from the rafters first. But yes, I'll come. She stood before the schoolhouse 2 days later, chalk in hand, gray hair pinned back with care. Children filled the benches, some fidgeting, some wide-eyed. She called the roll with clarity and ease, every name spoken like a promise. The room, once forgotten, came alive beneath her voice. Not loud, not commanding, but sure. A voice built not from volume, but from the quiet strength of a woman who had chosen to stay. At the back of the room, leaning against the door frame, Silas watched her. Arms crossed, eyes narrowed against the sunlight pouring through the windows. He didn't smile, but something in him softened, like thawed ground giving way to green. She turned once, caught his eye and nodded. No more than that. But in the space between them was everything. She had found her place, and he, at long last, had found peace enough to let her shine. The snow was gone now, melted into the thirsty ground, and carried off by the winding creek that whispered again beneath the trees. Where drifts once piled high against the cabin walls, now daffodils dared to bloom, their yellow heads swaying gently in the breeze like tiny flags of quiet victory. Spring didn't come all at once, it never did, but it had begun its slow procession, step by tender step, and the land around Silas McGraw's cabin had softened enough to allow things to grow. Eleanor was in the garden early, sleeves rolled, skirt pinned up at the ankles. The soil was damp and dark, rich with promise. Green shoots peeked through rows she'd tended with care, and between them, the thin branches of the apple tree stood upright and proud, its bark no longer gray, but streaked with hints of red and gold. Tiny buds had formed at its tips, like the mountain had finally forgiven itself for winter. Silas watched her from the porch for a long while before picking up the wood he'd set aside days ago. The boards had waited through frost and doubt, but the time felt right now. He measured each piece with quiet precision, cutting and sanding, letting the rhythm of the work settle his thoughts. The bench took shape slowly, its legs carved from old cedar posts, the seat worn smooth by the draw knife he hadn't used in years. When it was done, he carried it to the base of the tree without a word. Eleanor looked up from where she knelt, wiping dirt from her hands onto her apron. She didn't ask why, didn't need to. She stood, brushed the hair from her brow, and sat down, her palms resting gently on the wood. Silas sat beside her, leaving space between them, not out of formality, but respect. They faced the garden together, saying nothing. The wind was soft, the sky a gentle stretch of blue, and the scent of earth drifted up like memory. Birds had returned, their songs light and scattered, and somewhere in the valley below, the faint sound of a hammer echoed from a house being repaired. Eleanor reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, leather-bound book, worn at the corners, its spine cracked from years of opening. She turned to a page, cleared her throat softly, and began to read. Her voice, low and steady, carried the words like water over stone. Though roots be buried deep in grief and limbs stripped bare by storm, the tree endures, not for what it was, but for what it may yet bear. Silas closed his eyes. He didn't need to see her to hear her, and he didn't need to speak to know she understood. The sound of her voice smoothed the rough edges inside him, not filling the empty places, but honoring them. They stayed like that for some time, long after the poem ended. No vows passed between them, no grand declarations, but in the hush of that mountain clearing, with new leaves just beginning to open and old wounds no longer aching like they used to, healing had taken root, deep and unseen, but sure. When the sun began to dip behind the ridge, painting the sky in soft hues of amber and lavender, Silas reached down and pressed his palm into the dirt. Warm, alive. The garden had survived the winter. So had they. The cabin grew quieter as spring deepened, not with emptiness, but with the calm that follows long storms. The kind of quiet filled with purpose, like a pond after the wind has gone. Days came softer now. Chores were done with ease, and talk drifted lightly through the rooms. One morning, while Eleanor was kneeling in the garden, her hands gently lifting weeds from between young shoots, Silas sat at the table inside with a blank sheet of paper before him and a pencil worn down from years of disuse. At first, he simply stared. The lines of the wood beneath the page reminded him of the rings inside a tree, layer after layer, season after season, building towards something whole. He touched the pencil to the paper, paused, and began to write. Not a letter, not this time, but a story. It came slow, like thawing ground. He wrote of a girl with golden hair who used to chase fireflies through twilight fields. He wrote of a woman with kind eyes who sang hymns while washing dishes, who danced barefoot on the porch when she thought no one was looking. He wrote of the crack and roar of cannon fire, of the smell of smoke and blood, of comrades who never made it home, and the silence they left behind. He wrote until his fingers cramped and the sun shifted across the floor. When he stopped, the first story was done. Eleanor found it later that day, neatly folded on the table. She didn't ask permission. She read it slowly, a hand at her throat. When she reached the end, she said nothing at first, only sat beside him and placed the page gently in her lap. "You should keep going," she said. "Your voice still carries." Silas nodded, unsure how to respond. But the next day he wrote again, and the day after that. Soon the table was cluttered with pages, some half-written, others smudged and rewritten, all of them poured from a place he had once locked up tight. Eleanor read each one, smoothing creases, circling words in pencil, offering notes in the margins with a soft hand. She never changed his voice, only helped it sing clearer. One morning, she placed 3 stories in an envelope, addressed it to the editor of the Stillwater Frontier Gazette, and sealed it before he could argue. "Let someone else carry them for a while," she said. Weeks passed. Then a reply arrived. The editor, a man named Fenimore Clay, called the stories raw and redemptive and asked for more. He published them under the title Letters from the Ridge. Soon, copies of the paper made their way up the valley and through the town. People read Silas's words aloud in kitchens, on porches, in the back of the church after Sunday services. Men who once called him mad now nodded at him on the street. Women lingered longer in the general store to ask Eleanor about the apple tree, the garden, the quiet man with a loud soul. Children pointed at the newspaper and asked if the stories were true. And they were. Every one of them. They had become more than names on a petition or whispers in the hills. Silas and Eleanor were no longer just the strange pair on the mountain. They were keepers of something deeper. Pain turned to meaning. Sorrow offered up like seed to soil. Their cabin, once a house of ghosts, was now a place of stories. And in those stories, the valley saw itself. Not perfect, not proud, but enduring. Silas wrote every day now, not because he had to, but because he could. And every night, Eleanor read what he wrote, her eyes steady, her voice gentle, her presence the steady ink beneath every word. The first day of school did not begin with a bell, but with birdsong and the clatter of wood being set into place. Silas rose early, as he always did, though now his mornings were different. Less about duty and more about building something that would last. The smell of sawdust clung to his coat as he finished the last of the child-sized desks, each one carved with a careful hand, smoothed to avoid splinters, and sized just right for a growing frame and a curious mind. Eleanor swept the floors, lined the shelves with books worn at the edges, but still rich with stories. She'd pushed the table aside to make room for rows of desks. Curtains had been freshly washed and the hearth swept clean. What was once a place of healing for 2 had now stretched wide enough to welcome many. When the children arrived, they came in clusters, brothers and sisters, cousins and neighbors. Some shy, some noisy, their boots muddy and faces ruddy from the climb. They stared in awe at the tidy room, at the neat rows of desks, at the woman with the calm smile and gray hair who stood by the fire and welcomed them by name. They planted flowers before they ever opened a book. Eleanor handed each child a small trowel and a handful of seeds, and together they surrounded the apple tree with promise. The buds on its branches had begun to swell, a promise of blossoms soon to come. Silas watched from the porch, arms crossed, a quiet joy pulling at the corner of his mouth. As the children filed inside, Eleanor led them in reciting the alphabet, then read aloud from a story about a fox and a farmer. When her voice grew hoarse, she turned to Silas. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, took the book in his large hands, and began to read. His voice was gravel wrapped in honey, deep, slow, deliberate. The children leaned forward, drawn by the cadence, the rhythm, the way he gave breath to every word like it mattered. Afternoons became a routine. The children recited letters, practiced sums, planted radishes, and listened to stories by firelight. The cabin, once so quiet it echoed, now pulsed with laughter, questions, and the soft scratch of pencils on paper. The townspeople came slowly at first, a pie left at the door, a stack of books handed over with an awkward smile. A carpenter from town dropped off a small chalkboard. Maeve, the midwife, brought a box of writing slates and sat with the children to teach songs she learned as a girl. Even those who had once doubted now lingered longer, drawn by something unspoken. One day after the lesson, a little girl with braids and a missing front tooth looked up at Silas as he was closing a book of poems and asked, "Is Miss Eleanor your wife?" Silas paused. Eleanor looked up from where she was wiping a chalkboard, a quiet smile in her eyes. He didn't look at her when he answered, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't need to. "No," he said gently, setting the book down. "She's my home." The room fell still. The children didn't entirely understand, not yet, but they felt the truth in it, felt it in the way Eleanor's eyes softened and in the way Silas's voice didn't shake. Outside, the wind stirred through the branches of the apple tree. A single white blossom had opened. Spring no longer crept. It arrived with confidence now, a familiar guest greeted with open windows and the scent of lilacs through the valley. The cabin, once a lonely dot tucked into the mountainside, had changed. The porch was larger, wide enough for gatherings. A small addition off the back served as a permanent schoolroom. Flower beds lined the walk. Children's laughter echoed through the hollows like the warble of meadowlarks. The apple tree stood at the center of it all, no longer a twisted relic, but a full, bearing tree. Each year it offered fruit, enough for pies and preserves, enough to mark time by. Its roots had grown strong in the soil Eleanor once tended with quiet prayers and aching hands. Now those same hands had gone silver white, her fingers slower, but still purposeful. She still read to the children, though now they were often the children of children she'd once taught. Silas moved slower too, his steps measured, his shoulders less burdened, but slightly bowed with age. His beard, once like steel wool, had softened and gone white. He still carved, still told stories, still read to the little ones who begged to sit by his feet. His hands, though weathered, never trembled when holding a book. If anything, his voice had deepened, not louder, but more rooted. Every word he spoke seemed to come from the core of him, shaped by fire and silence, and finally peace. The townsfolk came and went. Some passed on, others stayed. A few who had once whispered behind closed doors now brought their grandchildren up the ridge to see Miss Eleanor and Mr. Silas. They'd point to the tree, to the schoolroom, to the worn bench, and tell the story again. They say he ordered a bride, young and pretty, to live up here in the cold. And what he got was a widow, they'd whisper, older, sharp-eyed, quiet as snow, and just as deep. But she didn't run. She stayed and changed everything. Over time, the facts blurred at the edges, as stories do. But the heart of it remained. Not a tale of romance, not in the way books told it. This was a story of redemption, of two people who carried grief like stones in their pockets, who found each other not in firelight or fate, but in silence, in shared labor, in small kindnesses that stitched brokenness into beauty. In late spring, Silas planted a second tree beside the first. He did it without fanfare. Eleanor watched from the porch, a quilt across her knees, a book resting unopened in her lap. When he finished, he sat beside her, brushing the soil from his palms. "Think it'll bear?" she asked. "In time," he said. The sun dipped behind the ridge. The wind was warm. A bell rang faintly from the schoolroom window. And so the land, like the heart, kept blooming. Not all love came early. Not all stories began in youth. But some, the rarest ones, arrived when the world had gone quiet, when the winter had done its worst and still found spring.